The baby's cry was the sound of a dying thing. It wasn't a scream anymore. It was a whisper of air, a tiny puff of sound that barely disturbed the crushing silence of the cabin. Jake Morrison held his daughter, Emma, and walked. Back and forth. Back and forth across the rough-hewn floorboards of the home he'd built with his own hands. A home that had become a tomb. 4 days. It had been 4 days since his wife, Sarah, had bled out on their bed, giving their daughter life and taking her own with her. And in those 4 days, Jake had failed. He was failing the one promise he'd ever made that mattered. Keep her alive, Jake. Promise me. He could still hear Sarah's voice, weak but fierce. He could still feel the desperate grip of her hand. Now Emma was slipping through his fingers just like her mother had. He tried the sugar water again, the tip of a clean rag dipped in the sticky liquid. She turned her head, a movement so weak it broke his heart all over again. Her lips were cracked and pale. Her eyes, which should have been Sarah's brilliant blue, were dull, sunken things. He looked over his shoulder at the bed. Sarah was still there, beneath her favorite quilt. He couldn't bring himself to bury her. Not yet. Not while Emma was still fighting. It felt like burying them both. Cow's milk, goat's milk, honey water. Nothing worked. She was starving to death in his arms. The fire was dead. The cabin was cold. And a storm was coming. He saw it on the horizon. A bruised purple wall of cloud moving with unnatural speed. A Colorado blizzard. The kind that didn't just snow, it erased the world. 50 miles to town. A death sentence. For Emma now, for both of them if they tried to outrun the storm. He sank into the rocking chair by the cold hearth, defeated. The first flakes began to fall, fat and heavy. Emma's lips had a blue tint now. He was 28 years old, and his world was ending. He had lost his wife. He was losing his daughter. He was about to be utterly and completely alone. The wind began to howl, a low moan that grew into a scream. The cabin shuddered. Jake held Emma to his chest, closed his eyes, and prayed to a God he no longer believed in. He was saying goodbye. In a few hours, he would be alone in this cabin with 2 bodies. And then he heard it. Over the shriek of the wind, a sound so impossible it had to be a trick of his grieving mind. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft taps, gentle, patient. Jake's eyes snapped open. His heart hammered against his ribs. No one could be out there. No one. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles away. To be out in this was suicide. Knock, knock, knock. It was real. Someone was on his porch. He stood, his legs unsteady, Emma a feather-light weight in his arms. He shuffled to the door, his hand shaking as he reached for the latch. Who would be knocking on the door of a dead man in the middle of the apocalypse? He pulled the heavy wooden door inward. The wind tore at him, blasting snow and ice into the room. And standing on his porch, impossibly calm in the heart of the blizzard, was a woman. She was maybe 45, her black hair streaked with silver, her skin weathered like old leather. Snow clung to her shawl, but she didn't shiver. Her dark eyes were ancient and kind, and they weren't looking at him. They were fixed on the dying baby in his arms. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice steady and warm, laced with a Spanish accent. "The little one. She needs help." Jake was too stunned to speak. He just stepped back, and the woman entered. She didn't bring the cold in with her. She brought warmth. She brought the scent of wood smoke and something else. Herbs? Pine? She moved with a quiet confidence that was utterly unnerving. "I am Maria," she said, her eyes never leaving Emma. "She is very sick, this pequeña. She won't eat." The words tumbled out of Jake, a torrent of failure and fear. "It's been days. I've tried everything." Maria held out her arms. "May I?" He hesitated for a split second. This child was the last piece of Sarah he had. But then he looked into Maria's eyes, and he saw... He didn't know what he saw. Knowledge. Strength. Something ancient. He handed his daughter over. Maria took Emma with practiced hands, her movements efficient and sure. She checked the baby's temperature with a hand to her forehead, peered into her mouth, listened to her faint, rattling breaths. She murmured something soft in Spanish, a gentle, flowing lullaby, and Jake could have sworn Emma's labored breathing eased just a little. "She is weak," Maria said, her gaze meeting his. "But she is not lost." Her eyes flickered toward the bed, toward the still form under the quilt. "The mother?" Jake just nodded, his throat too tight to form words. Maria crossed herself, a quick, fluid motion. "Lo siento," she whispered. "I am sorry for your loss." She looked back at Emma. "But this one, she still fights. She is waiting for someone to show her how to live." From a leather saddlebag she carried, Maria produced a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a loaf of bread, impossibly, still warm. The smell filled the cabin, rich and yeasty and comforting. Jake watched, mesmerized, as she tore off a small piece. She put it in her own mouth and began to chew it, slowly, methodically, her eyes closed in concentration. "What are you doing?" Jake asked, his voice a raw croak. "What mothers have always done," Maria said, her voice soft, "for babies who cannot take the milk." She worked the bread into a soft paste. Then she dipped her little finger into the mash of bread and saliva, and gently, so gently, touched it to Emma's pale lips. The baby didn't respond. Maria did it again. Nothing. Jake's hope, a fragile thing he hadn't even realized was there, began to wither. Then Maria tried a third time, and Emma's mouth moved. Her tiny tongue, impossibly, darted out and tasted the offering. A moment later, a small, convulsive swallow. It was the first time his daughter had swallowed anything in 3 days. A tear tracked down Jake's face, leaving a hot trail on his cold skin. He watched as Maria repeated the process, again and again. Each time, a tiny swallow. Each swallow, a victory against the rattling silence of the grave. The blizzard raged outside, a wild beast trying to tear the cabin apart. But inside, this strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere was fighting it back with a piece of bread. And Jake Morrison, who had been ready to die, started to wonder if he was witnessing a miracle, or if he'd finally gone completely mad. Dawn broke gray and smothered. The world outside was a sea of white, drifts piled halfway up the cabin door. But inside, the world had changed. Emma was asleep. Not the terrifying, shallow stillness of the past few days, but a deep, peaceful sleep. Her chest rose and fell in a steady, miraculous rhythm. Jake hadn't moved all night. He'd sat in a chair, watching, counting every single breath as if it were a gold coin. Maria moved about the small cabin with a quiet purpose that made the space feel less like a coffin and more like a home again. She had rebuilt the fire, and its warmth pushed back against the gloom. She handed him a steaming mug. It smelled of mint and something else, something earthy. "She is stronger," Maria said. Her voice was a calm anchor in the sea of his exhaustion. "But she will need more than bread." Jake looked at this woman, this savior who had walked out of a blizzard. In the flat morning light, she seemed less like an apparition and more like a real person, which was somehow even more unsettling. Her hands were gnarled with work. Her eyes held a sorrow he recognized, but it was an old sorrow, one that had been lived with for a long time. "How did you find us?" he asked, the question that had been circling in his mind all night. "How did you even know we were here?" Maria sat in Sarah's rocking chair, its gentle creak a familiar ghost in the room. "I was camped in the valley, maybe 5 miles from here." 5 miles, through that storm. It didn't make sense. "The wind," she continued, "it carries sounds. I heard a baby crying, so faint I almost thought it was a ghost on the wind." Jake stared at her. No, impossible. Emma's cries had been whispers. The wind had been a physical force, a screaming wall of sound. No one could have heard anything. "When you have heard that sound as many times as I have," Maria said, her dark eyes locking onto his, "you do not mistake it for anything else. You do not ignore it." "You're a midwife," Jake said. It was a statement, not a question. "Una partera," she corrected gently. "Yes, For 30 years. In Mexico, in Texas, now here. Babies come when they will. They do not care about borders or blizzards. A wave of shame washed over Jake. I can't pay you. Maria waved his words away as if they were smoke. Payment? The payment is a life. This is enough. As if on cue, Emma stirred, making a small new sound. A sound of hunger, not despair. Maria was at her side in an instant, lifting her with an expert's touch. She wants more, she announced, a small smile touching her lips. This is good. The strength returns. This time, she prepared the bread but also pulled a small leather pouch from her bags. She crumbled some dried, dark green leaves into a cup of warm water. What is that? Jake asked, a fresh spike of unease. Yerba buena, she said. Mint. It calms the stomach. It helps the body accept what it needs. She dipped her finger in the minty water and let a drop fall onto Emma's tongue before offering the bread again. Emma took it eagerly this time, her tiny hands weakly grasping at Maria's fingers. A flush of pink was returning to her cheeks. Her eyes, when they opened, seemed to focus on Maria's face. Jake felt a dizzying surge of relief, so potent it felt like pain. He had been so ready for death that this sudden, fierce rush of life felt like a betrayal of his grief. She's going to live, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. See, Maria said, her voice soft but certain. She will live. She is a fighter. Like her papa, I think. Her papa. The word landed with the weight of an anvil. He was a father, and he had no idea what he was doing. Maria seemed to hear his silent panic. You are afraid. It wasn't a question. He could only nod. This is good, she said, her tone surprisingly gentle. The men who are not afraid make the worst fathers. Fear makes us careful. Fear makes us love better. She placed the sleeping Emma back in her makeshift crib and walked to the bed where Sarah lay. Jake tensed, a protective instinct rising in him. But Maria's movements were full of reverence. She gently pulled back the corner of the quilt and looked at Sarah's face. She was very young. 20, Jake said, his voice thick. We were only married 2 years. She gave her life for this pequeña, Maria said, her voice a low murmur. That is a mother's love. And now, she looked from Sarah to the sleeping baby. That love lives in her. I don't know how to do this alone, Jake confessed, the admission tearing from his soul. Maria moved to the window, peering out at the impossibly bright, snow-covered world. In the far distance, a thin curl of smoke was rising from a chimney. The Pattersons. You are not as alone as you believe, she said. Before the storm, I saw other lights in this valley, other homes. They know about Sarah, Jake said. We kept to ourselves. Sarah was shy. Maria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, a baby needs more than one pair of hands, more than one heart. And as if her words had summoned them, he heard a new sound, the crunch of snow, the jingle of a harness, horses. Someone was coming. A new kind of panic seized him. Visitors. Now? He felt exposed, his grief and failure raw for the world to see. I should tell them to go, he said, moving toward the door. Maria put a hand on his arm. It was surprisingly strong. Wait, she said. Let us see what the wind has brought this time. The knock was nothing like Maria's ghost-like tapping from the night before. This was a firm, solid rap. The knock of neighbors with business. Jake opened the door and blinked against the sun reflecting off the snow. Mrs. Patterson stood there, her round face etched with worry, her arms full of cloth-wrapped bundles. Behind her stood her husband, Tom, holding the reins of a pack horse loaded with supplies. Jake Morrison, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice leaving no room for argument. We saw the smoke from your chimney go out 2 days ago. We've come to see about the baby. Jake was speechless. He'd exchanged maybe 20 words with the Pattersons in 2 years, yet here they were. Mrs. Patterson pushed past him into the cabin, her sharp eyes taking in everything at once. The revived fire, Emma sleeping in the crib, and Maria standing by the hearth like she'd always been there. Oh, thank the good Lord, she breathed, her stern face softening with relief. "We heard the crying on the wind yesterday, just before the storm hit full. We feared the worst." Jake's blood ran cold. We heard the crying on the wind. The same impossible thing Maria had said. Tom Patterson tipped his hat to Maria. "Ma'am, looks like you got here first." "The little one needed help," Maria replied, her voice calm and even. Mrs. Patterson was already unpacking her bundles on the table. Jars of preserved peaches, smoked bacon, a dozen eggs, each one a treasure. I don't understand," Jake stammered. "Why?" Tom looked at him, his gaze direct and kind. "Because that's what neighbors do, son," he said simply. "And because Sarah asked us to." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Sarah asked them to? What did that mean? Before he could ask, Mrs. Patterson spoke again, her eyes on Maria. "So, you are the one she was waiting for." "Waiting for?" Maria gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. A silent communication passed between the two women, an entire conversation happening in a glance. Jake felt like a stranger in his own home. These people, the woman who appeared from a storm, the neighbors he barely knew, they all shared a secret that had something to do with his wife and his child. He looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully, saved by a miracle he no longer understood. He looked at Maria, whose story about hearing a cry from 5 miles away now seemed less like a miracle and more like a well-rehearsed lie. And he looked at the Pattersons, whose neighborly concern now felt like something else entirely, like they were soldiers reporting for duty. The cabin, which had started to feel like a haven, suddenly felt like a trap. He was surrounded by a conspiracy of kindness, and he had no idea why. The warmth of the fire felt false. The food on the table felt like a bribe. His daughter was alive, but the ground had just fallen out from under his feet. He wasn't being saved. He was being managed. But by whom? And for what purpose? In the weeks that followed, Jake's cabin was transformed. It became a hub of quiet, purposeful activity. Maria stayed, settling into the rhythm of the household as if she'd been born to it. She taught Jake things he never imagined he'd need to know. How to test the temperature of milk on his wrist. How to swaddle a baby so she felt secure. How to distinguish the cry of hunger from the cry of pain. Under her care, Emma blossomed. She gained weight, her skin turned a healthy pink, and her eyes, Sarah's eyes, began to watch the world with a bright, alert curiosity. The Pattersons came and went, always with food, or firewood, or a piece of advice. Tom helped Jake dig a grave for Sarah in the thawing earth. It was a simple, quiet service, just the three of them and the silent mountains as witnesses. But through it all, Jake felt like he was watching a play where everyone else knew their lines but him. The mystery of their arrival, the shared, impossible story of hearing Emma's cry on the wind, hung in the air, unspoken. He watched Maria constantly. She was a bottomless well of knowledge, not just about babies, but about herbs, about the weather, about the ways of the land. She seemed to know where everything was in the cabin without asking. One afternoon, she was looking for more thread to mend one of Jake's shirts. "It should be in the small wooden box on the high shelf," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Jake froze. That was Sarah's sewing box. He'd put it up there himself after she died, unable to look at it. There was no way Maria could have known where it was. Another time, as he rocked a fussy Emma by the fire, Maria began to hum. A simple, haunting little tune. Jake's blood turned to ice. It was a lullaby Sarah used to hum when she was pregnant, a tune she said her own mother had sung to her. He had never heard it from another living soul. "Where did you hear that song?" he asked, his voice tight. Maria stopped humming, her face unreadable in the firelight. "It is an old song," she said evasively, "from my home." Jake didn't push. He was afraid of the answer. He was afraid of shattering the fragile peace that had settled over their lives. Emma was thriving. He was learning to be a father. Wasn't that enough? But the questions festered. He started searching. When Maria was outside gathering herbs, or when she was asleep, he would go through her meager belongings in the small saddlebag she kept by her bedroll. There wasn't much. Dried herbs, some worn clothing, a small rosary. And at the very bottom, tucked into a fold of leather, he found a photograph. It was old and faded, the edges soft with wear. It was a picture of two women. One was a much younger Maria. The other was a teenage girl with brilliant blue eyes and a familiar, defiant smile. It was Sarah. The world tilted on its axis. He sank onto the floor, the photograph shaking in his hand. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't some wandering midwife. He didn't know who she was, but she had known his wife. She had lied to him from the moment she set foot on his porch. Every act of kindness, every piece of advice, every gentle touch she'd given his daughter was now tainted. Why the lie? Why the elaborate story? He thought back to what Mrs. Patterson had said. So, you are the one she was waiting for. Sarah had been waiting for this woman. But why? And why hadn't she ever mentioned her? He remembered the conversations he and Sarah had had about her family. She'd been estranged from them for years, especially her mother. She described her as a hard, domineering woman, steeped in old-world traditions and superstitions. A woman who had disapproved of Sarah's decision to marry a simple rancher and move west. Sarah had always spoken of her mother with a mixture of anger and a deep, unhealed sadness. He looked from the photograph to the woman sleeping peacefully across the room. The woman who had saved his daughter's life. Was this her? Sarah's mother? The woman his wife had run halfway across the country to escape? It was impossible. And yet, it was the only thing that made sense. The knowledge of the lullaby. The location of the sewing box. The way she looked at Emma. Not just with a caregiver's affection, but with a fierce, proprietary love that seemed to go deeper. He felt a hot surge of anger, followed by a cold wave of fear. Who was this person, really? If she was Sarah's mother, why hide it? What did she want? He had let a complete stranger, a liar, into the heart of his home, into the heart of his grief. He had handed her the most precious thing in his life. The storm outside had ended weeks ago. But Jake realized, with a dawning horror, that a new and far more dangerous storm had just begun, right inside his own cabin. He had to know the truth. He stood up, the photograph clenched in his fist, and walked over to where she slept. He needed to wake her up. He needed answers. Now. He stood over her sleeping form, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The urge to shake her awake, to demand the truth, was a fire in his veins. But he stopped. He looked down at her face, softened in sleep, and saw the deep lines of exhaustion and old grief etched around her eyes. Whatever the truth was, it was complicated. A direct confrontation felt clumsy, dangerous. He needed more information. He needed leverage. He put the photograph back exactly where he found it, and spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance. He watched her every move, listened to her every word, trying to piece together the puzzle. He became an actor, playing the part of the grateful, clueless father, while inside he was a storm of suspicion. The break came from an unexpected source. Reverend Williams and a young woman named Beth Coleman arrived one afternoon. Beth was a widow with a young son, and her eyes held the same deep understanding of loss that Jake saw in his own reflection. While the adults talked, Beth's son, Tommy, a boisterous 5-year-old, was fascinated by Maria. "Are you a witch?" he asked with the blunt curiosity of a child. Maria laughed, a rich, warm sound. "No, pequeño. I am just a woman who listens to the plants." But later, as they were preparing to leave, Beth pulled Jake aside. "I knew Sarah a little," she said softly. "We talked a few times when we were both expecting. She was so excited, but she was also worried." "Worried about what?" Jake asked, his senses on high alert. "Her mother," Beth said, lowering her voice. "She said her mother was coming. She seemed terrified of it. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would check on the baby. That's why I came with the Reverend today." Beth's words were the final key in the lock. It was true. All of it. Sarah had known she was coming, and she had been afraid. That night, after Emma was asleep, Jake couldn't hold it in any longer. He built up the fire, the crackling flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He sat across from Maria, the air thick with unspoken tension. "Sarah was afraid of you," he said, his voice flat and hard. Maria didn't flinch. She simply stopped her mending and looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a sadness so profound it stole his breath. "Yes," she said. "She was. You're her mother." It wasn't a question. "My name is Magdalena Santos," she said quietly. "Sarah was my only child." The confession, so simple and direct, knocked the anger out of him, leaving only a hollow ache. "Why?" he whispered. "Why all the lies?" "Would you have let me in if I had told you the truth?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "A man I had never met, in his moment of deepest grief? You would have seen me as a threat. You would have sent me away. And Emma." Her voice broke for the first time. "Emma would have died. I could not let that happen. I could not lose my daughter and my granddaughter on the same mountain." She told him everything. She and Sarah had been torn apart by pride and stubbornness. Magdalena had been too controlling, too steeped in her traditions. Sarah had been too desperate for freedom. When Magdalena learned Sarah was pregnant, she wrote, begging for a reconciliation. Sarah, still hurt and proud, refused. But Magdalena came anyway. She couldn't stay away. She was camped in the valley for a month before Emma was born, watching the cabin from a distance, respecting Sarah's wishes but unable to leave. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of her daughter's life. "I saw the smoke from the chimney stop," Magdalena said, her voice raw. "I waited. I prayed. But no one came or went. And then I heard her. The baby. Her cries grew weaker each day. I knew. I knew Sarah was gone, and that you were alone, and that the baby was dying. The blizzard," she explained, "was not an obstacle. It was an opportunity. It was her cover. It was the only way she could approach the cabin and offer help as a stranger, as Maria, without Jake rejecting her out of loyalty to Sarah's anger. I did what I had to do to save the only piece of my daughter I have left," she finished, tears finally tracing paths down her weathered cheeks. "If you want me to leave now, I will go." Jake looked at her. This fierce, broken, stubborn woman who had traveled 1,000 miles, lived like a hermit in the wilderness, and lied her way into his home, all for the love of a child and a grandchild. He looked at the crib where Emma slept, her breath a steady whisper in the quiet room. His anger was gone. In its place was a vast, complicated wave of emotion, gratitude, sorrow, understanding. This woman hadn't come to take anything from him. She had come to give him back his world. Outside, he heard the sound of horses again. He looked through the window and saw Tom and Martha Patterson dismounting, their faces grim with purpose. They had seen the fire burning high and late and had come to check on them. Jake opened the door before they could knock. "You knew," he said to them. "You knew who she was all along." Martha Patterson didn't deny it. "Sarah came to us a month before the baby was due," she explained, her voice heavy with remembered sadness. "She told us her mother was in the valley. She was still so angry, but she was scared too. She made us promise, Tom and me, that if the worst happened, we would make sure her mother looked after the baby. She knew you wouldn't know what to do. She knew her mother was the only one who could save her." It all clicked into place. The Pattersons' arrival wasn't a coincidence. Their story about hearing the cry was the same lie Magdalena had told. It was all a coordinated plan. A secret pact made by his wife from beyond the grave to save their daughter. He hadn't been alone in failing. He had been surrounded by a hidden network of guardians, all orchestrated by a wife who had known she might not survive. He turned and looked at Magdalena. She was no longer a stranger or a liar. She was Sarah's last gift to him and Emma. She was family. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're home." For the first time, Magdalena smiled. It was a watery, broken thing, but it was a smile of relief, of forgiveness, of a love so powerful it had defied distance, anger, and even death itself. And in the small Colorado cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the guardians of the present, a new and extraordinary family was born. The seasons turned, the snows melted, replaced by a riot of summer wildflowers. The cabin, once a place of profound grief, was now filled with the sounds of life. Emma's gurgles turned into laughter. She learned to crawl, her chubby hands exploring every inch of her small world, and she was adored. Magdalena, who Emma would soon know only as Abuela, was a constant, loving presence. She filled the home with the smells of her cooking and the sound of her old lullabies, songs that no longer chilled Jake's blood, but warmed his heart. A living link to Sarah. The Pattersons and other neighbors were no longer strangers, but fixtures in their lives. The conspiracy of kindness had blossomed into a true community. Beth Coleman and her son Tommy became their most frequent visitors. Jake found an easy comfort with Beth. They were two people fluent in the language of loss, able to talk about their departed spouses with a mixture of sorrow and love that no one else could quite understand. They didn't have to pretend. They could just be. Tommy, having no memory of his own father, began to look at Jake with a quiet hero worship. He appointed himself Emma's official protector and playmate, a role he took with the utmost seriousness. Jake watched the two children playing on the cabin floor, watched Beth and Magdalena chatting like old friends, and felt a sense of peace he never thought he would experience again. One evening, after the Colemans had gone home and Emma was asleep, Jake found Magdalena on the porch, staring out at the star-dusted mountains. "She would be happy, you know," Jake said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Sarah. She would be angry as hell that you two never made up. But she would be so happy to see Emma like this. So loved." "She is so much like her," Magdalena said, her voice thick. "The same stubborn spirit, the same bright eyes. When I look at her, I see my Sarah all over again." "I see her too," Jake admitted. "For a long time it hurt. Every time I looked at Emma, it was a reminder of what I'd lost. But now when I look at her, it's a reminder of what Sarah gave me." They stood in comfortable silence for a long time. Two people from different worlds, bound together by their shared love for a woman and a child. The lies and secrets that had marked the beginning of their relationship had burned away, leaving only the strong, clean truth of their connection. They were a family. Not a normal one, perhaps, but a real one, forged in the fires of tragedy and sealed by a promise. A year to the day after Sarah's death, the cabin was filled with people. It was Emma's first birthday. The entire valley, it seemed, had come to celebrate. Tom Fletcher had carved her a beautiful wooden horse. Martha Patterson had baked a cake. Beth was there, her hand finding Jake's naturally, their fingers intertwining. Tommy proudly presented Emma with a smooth, gray rock he had declared to be the most perfect rock in all of Colorado. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the valley, Jake stood on the porch, holding his daughter. Emma babbled happily, pointing a chubby finger at the moon rising over the peaks. Beth came and stood beside him, her son Samuel, just 3 weeks old, sleeping soundly in a sling against her chest. Magdalena had delivered him right here in this cabin, her steady hands bringing another new life into their world. Tommy leaned against Jake's leg, tired from a day of play. Magdalena sat in her rocking chair, humming that familiar lullaby, her eyes shining with tears of joy. Jake looked at this improbable, beautiful family that had risen from the ashes of his despair. His wife was gone, but her love was everywhere. It was in her daughter's eyes. It was in her mother's hands. It was in the community that had embraced him and the new love that had healed him. He had lost everything, only to find it all again in a way he never could have imagined. This cabin was not a tomb. It was a sanctuary. Proof that even after the most brutal storm, life finds a way, that the deepest wounds can heal, and that family is not just about the blood you share, but about the people who show up in the darkness and promise to help you find the dawn. What do you think Sarah would say if she could see them all now? If you enjoyed this story of hope and healing, and you believe that love is the strongest force in the universe, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the next one.